Hello and welcome to the ILC Home and Commercial webinar series looking at environmental and agricultural claims. I'm Alan Souter, I'm the chair of ILC's Home and Commercial arm. So firstly, let me have a big thanks to our sponsors today. Our main sponsors, platinum sponsors, are Questgate, who of course hold massive expertise in this area, and I'm absolutely delighted that Chris Hall and his team have decided to back us with this. It really helps get these particular types of seminar out to as many people as possible. Also to our silver sponsors, RSK Raw, and a big thanks to Neil Stothert and his team as well. In this series, we're going to be taking a look at all aspects of environmental and agricultural claims, the risks, the exposures, the use and timeliness of experts, and of course, all the legal and regulatory aspects which can come into play. So let's get on with today's webinar. And welcome to today's webinar, which is the third in the series of environmental and agricultural claims. This is going to be the first one where we begin taking a more serious look at the environmental issues within the agricultural sector. So this is going to be a new avenue for us. It's going to be quite interesting. I think it will be the first discussion of more with more to come. That would be my view on it anyway. But is anybody who's new coming into this, because they work mostly in the environmental sector, welcome to Untitled Claims. Delighted to have you on board. If you have any questions and any thoughts that you want to ask after this, or thoughts that you might have, please just drop me a note at alan@iloveclaims.com, and we'll happily introduce you to I Love Claims and things that go on outside of just the agricultural and environmental area. I think today's panel, we're really pleased to have experts in the issue, and that's really put pressure on them when you tell them they're experts before they start. So we've got Roger Morgan, the MD of Farm and General Insurance. We've got Aidan Lennon from NFU Mutual, John Mockridge, who's the Ops Director Environmental at Questgate, and Neil Stothert, the MD for RSK Raw. So welcome to having you all on board. Things we're going to go through today, we will try and start at the beginning and talk about the types of environmental incidents that happen in the agricultural world. We will see what the effects of of diversification within the agricultural industry, what effects that might have. We'll look at some of the pollution incidents and challenge some of the challenges of managing these incidents. And of course, we can't do this without regulations and regulators and what that means. And we might venture, I think, into policy considerations and how the future might look at the things that should be applied, but what are the barriers that stop them doing it. So I said a lot of things there. I'm sure within the timescale we probably won't cover them that well, but we will cover them over the piece of this series of environmental and agricultural webinars. So welcome to you all. I guess let's start right at the beginning. Yeah, what types of environmental incidents tend to occur within agriculture? Well, let me start with you first of all, Roger.
So thank you, Alan. The types of claims that I've seen and been involved with in the last 10 years are focused around fuel tanks, runoff, and perhaps the more worrying ones would be liquid fertilizer. So that's really the three main areas that I seem to have been focused on. Yeah.
What about you, Eddie? What happens when you're sitting there in NFU, busy looking after all your members? What sort of incidents come in that cover the sort of areas that Roger was talking about?
Well, absolutely. I'd have to echo what Roger says. Those three main areas we would see quite a lot. But to add to that, and it's probably my most common type of claim, is from slurry. So this would be from slurry lagoons, slurry slats, just standard on a farm. So I'm sure John would probably back me up. It's usually a Friday afternoon. We would usually get a very panicked phone call from one of our agents or brokers to report, that the worst has happened and that a slurry tank has burst or a lagoon has burst. And yeah, havoc. It's quite a fast-paced new notification of a claim, whereas other claims we get, there's usually a nice time frame that we can gather our thoughts and gather our investigations. But when these type of claims happen, there's quite literally a pollutant running down the lane or running into a river. So it's all systems go once it's reported.
And you presumably, Aidan, have a supply chain lined up behind that, which is tuned into very, very quick action.
Absolutely. So all our suppliers do have 24-hour helplines for these type of incidents. I don't know why, but 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, as I say, is usually peak time for these things to happen. But yes, I have to say, once we are alerted to one of these incidents happening, we can get help out as soon as possible. It's everybody is very in tune with the urgency of these types of incidents, so it's a good line to have.
John is the recipient of 4:30 on a Friday afternoon.
Oh yes.
From insurers. These incidents, what kind of other incidents do you get? How different might you respond to some of them?
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and hello, everyone. The typical Friday special tends to come our way, but with regards to the types of incidents we're involved in, yes, just to mirror what everyone's saying there, the slurry, silage, oil incidents as well. But fertilizers is a growing concern. Basically, anything that's being spread around the farm or stored on the farm is a potential risk. So we can have any kind of pollution event from any particular type of contaminant, and it's all about the response. So as Aidan was saying there, as soon as we become aware of an incident, we've got to jump on it straight away. The agricultural sector, fantastic when the farmers are involved from the outset, because they know the implications of not dealing with this immediately, the issues that can have on them with regulators and the like. So they tend to appreciate the hands-on approach that insurers and loss adjusters and panel environmental consultants will provide to get to site pretty much promptly to begin with that cleanup operations beyond what they've done already. It's all about that containment measures from the outset. But as Aidan was saying, slurry is a big one, big one for us. You'll have scenarios where you'll have slurry tankers. It's not just about spreading, it's also about the storage of. So you may have a prolonged period of heavy rainfall and a slurry storage facility which is coming to the end of its natural life, and that wall is ready to collapse, and lo and behold, it does collapse, and then you have a tidal wave of slurry washing down through the farm, which is going down into a valley, and can often be on a Friday afternoon kind of special. And with Neil, we'll arrange for people to respond to that as required. And if it's over the weekend, it's over the weekend, unfortunately. But that's the nature of the business that we're in. Environmental incidents will happen at any particular time, and we're there ready for it to deal with it when it does.
There you go. John has mentioned in previous conversations with me the times he sometimes has to go out and work. So I guess that passes all the way through then to Neil at the cleaning up end of this and testing end. I guess this is quite a difficult one. So give me an example of the stuff you called out to, and then in the instance where we've now seen that John's been instructed and come to you what you have to do.
Hello, Alan, and good to see everyone, and thanks for having me back on. This is really interesting subject matter, really. And as everybody says, weekends or particularly bank holidays, they tend to be pretty popular for call-outs. I think John just holds them up until sort of late on the Friday, really, before the bank holiday. Although on a serious note with that, I think in some cases, people aren't, or farmers, not just farmers, there's lots of people aren't that sure how serious an incident is, and it gets closer and closer towards the weekend. And if it's a bank holiday, if it's a 3 or 4 day sort of bank holiday, there's sort of, people start to get quite concerned. If they don't do something before the bank holiday, it's going to be quite a few days, they think, before something's going to happen. It's not strictly true, because if they call their insurer during that weekend, we would still respond anyway. But it's just psychologically, they want to get it sorted, try and get it sorted before the bank holiday. Everybody's sort of correct there, though. I mean, yes, we deal with quite a few oil losses, even just general heating oil, which we've spoken about at length in the domestic market, but quite a few plant oil losses as well. Fires, particularly, seem to get quite a few of them in the summer months, particularly with combines, which catch fire, and obviously very dry fields. And we we end up having to clean up a lot of hydraulic spills and diesel spills. But there was mentioned pesticides, herbicides. We've done quite a number of herbicide spills, and they're quite complicated compared to something like oil. Oil is easy; it floats. Some solvents are quite easy because they sink, but then you end up with something like fertilizers and herbicides, and what the farmers will often use a concoction of different herbicides. Some will be held in a sort of colloidal suspension. Some will actually be soluble, and you're trying. And when that spill occurs, which could be a spraying plant which topples over, ends up in a ditch. The herbicide ends up in a ditch, getting into watercourses, and you're trying to deal with something that's actually in suspension, which is far more difficult than, say, oil floating on water. But we deal with, there's other things as well as the silage. There's and slower, you're looking at milk. I think it's worth saying what on the last agency survey, I think 9% of serious pollution incidents were down to the agricultural industry. So I think that outside of the water industry, it's the largest industry causing serious pollution incidents. So that's why it's so important to respond quickly. And you have to remember, this is the way they occur is completely different to our average factory that we respond to. In a factory, we've got secondary containment, we've got tertiary containment. Well, we rarely get that on farms. If you lose it, it's gone straight to ground or gone to watercourses. So that's why that initial response is so key.
And presumably not in an easy place to find either, or access for that matter. So that's quite interesting. And I think one of the things that I've heard a few times there is perhaps more than most policyholders in other areas of insurance, farmers have a better understanding of what's happening to them and the necessity for action. But farming has changed, as we know, over the last 2 years. So how has that diversification affected environmental claims, Roger? I mean, it must have affected within the sector. And has that changed, or is it changing the type of claims that we're seeing?
From my point of view, as a farm insurance broker, I'm not seeing the claims because I probably don't have enough exposure in this area. So, and personally, I would have thought that most diversification dwarfs in exposure compared to most of the farming activities. But I'm sure it is there, and I'll leave this to my colleagues to throw some light on this one, Alan.
Okay, so that's a quick pass for Aidan.
Yeah.
I have to say, our members really have stayed quite traditionally farming. I haven't seen too many forms of claims where the farmers have diversified their practices. The only thing I really can say is that farmers are now tending to lease out and have more tenants than maybe they would have in the past. If that's diversification, if that's what people want to view it as, so be it. But those type of claims where a tenant is on the farming land or the farming property, and they maybe have disappeared, for lack of a better word, and left a bit of a mess behind them to clean up, whether they were involved with recycling activities or some other type of business, that can then lead to an environmental claim if there's hazardous substances left behind, things like that. But in terms of different methods of farming, I personally haven't seen too much of a difference. So apologies, Alan, I can't really add too much to that either.
Just a quick one. I'll move that one on to John, but I'll ask a subsequent question. Who tends to pick up? Whose is the policy when we've got a tenant? Is it the farm owner? Is it the tenant? And is there any mix-up, John, that you tend to find within that when you go to deal with a claim?
Yeah, something we need to establish quite quickly, that is, Alan, really, as to who the responsible party is. Not in relation to just the cleanup side that's required, but also for where any statutory liability will rest, whether it's going to be with the occupier of the land, the operator for that land, or the owner. Predominantly, usually, it is the actual occupier. So whoever is in charge of that particular area of land, they are responsible for any contamination events arising from occupying that land. So it will usually be the occupier. In the agricultural sector, more often than not, the farmers will be tenant farmers. And the leases will essentially say that the responsibility for any environmental incidents arising from farming activities will fall to the tenant farmer. So pretty much from the outset, we're assuming that the operator of that site is the responsible party, and proceeding from there. In that sense, obviously checking up through appropriate leases is where required. But going back to the diversification, as Aidan says, it's pretty much traditional farming, which is still prominent throughout. But there are a few areas such as sort of power from waste. So we're talking about anaerobic digester plants. More and more farmers getting into that, like solar panels as well. And wind turbines. So the wind turbines, as an example, they've got lubricants within them, and if one of those pops, then that oil is being spread around the site. But with the anaerobic digesters, that's the biggest one. It's essentially contamination events arising from failure of new technology. And whilst it's a slow change to the industry, it is becoming more and more prominent throughout. And with anaerobic digester plants, if there's an incident, it will cause a big pollution event. But you've also got the waste product from the end of that. You are transporting that somewhere. If it's on site, it's not an issue. If it's off site to a different party, then essentially you might have to have a waste carrier license. And if at any stage that waste is lost to ground, that causes a bigger pollution event as well. The business lets, the farming business lets, is as Aideen said, is a common one where someone's brought waste or something onto the land. I think the other one really would be sort of leisure and tourism. You've got farmers diversifying out to building holiday lets, nice cabins, or even if it's just a caravan park, just to bring in more lines of revenue. And as a consequence of that, you need a sewage treatment plant. A lot of farmers will have new systems installed, but there may be historic systems available, which they can tap into. However, they won't be compliant with changes in regulations. And if there's a pollution event or any damage to the system as a consequence of that, then we'd have to respond to those incidents as well.
Thanks, John. Neil, I will be going to ask Roger in a few minutes about ideal levels of coverage or things, but of course part of the problem is when you get on to actively deal with something like this is being comfortable enough that the cover is there to the level that would be required, or keep people like John involved in how much work you're doing. Secondly, what happens when this then, we've held this in the other environmental claims, spills onto somebody else's land, doesn't just stay there, or perhaps is being dealt with but is proving to be an immediate threat to, it doesn't have to be another farmer, it could be a house, it could be a factory, it could be anything. So what are the complications that can arise around that?
Nice easy one. As it's been mentioned about the sort of the tenanted farms, which seems to be becoming quite common now, and John mentioned about the operator on the site being sort of being liable, but some of the problems we've experienced is that the people are now because the economics mean that you need to have larger farms, particularly in the UK. So you're having people leasing farmland further away from where they're traditionally operating. So they're tracking spray equipment over much greater distances. There's much larger chance of an incident happening. They're cutting across other people's fields with nothing more than a gentleman's agreement. But of course, that's the point at which the whole sprayer falls into a ditch and this type of thing. So it's trying to establish, like John was talking about, it's trying to establish, well, who actually caused the incident and whose lands is it on and what's it actually impacting? And that becomes quite a problem for us, because initially, the farmer wants it dealt with. The initial insurance company will probably want it dealt with, but it can take a few days to realise this is a little bit more complicated than it first seemed. And as you say, we are a business, and all our competitors are businesses. We do need to be paid. And when you are sometimes in a situation where even the farmer will say, "Well, yes, I'm the tenant of this farm, but I've sublet the spraying to a completely different business," because you have businesses that purely go around spraying some of the smaller holdings. And it's just trying to piece all this together to try and figure out who is going to pay. Farmers' margins are very tight, as we always get told. So it's a bit different to working for your average blue chip company where, I can take a gamble in many respects, or we get an assurance from the owners of the business, we're going to get paid whatever, even if the insurance company doesn't pay. It's slightly different on farming. And you do have to piece all those bits together to understand how the jigsaw works, and just to get confidence that, your bills are going to be covered.
That's interesting. Roger, it moves us on to something we probably thought we could cover later, but immediately opens up, for me, policy considerations. So the complexities are, do people have enough cover? Who's covered? whose fault was it? Was it the tenant? Was it the sublet? Was it the guy that was doing the spray? And each one of these people, whoever you or Aidan, everybody else finds is going to be responsible for this, we have to know that they have sufficient cover. Now, in the more regular market, we understand that it's a price-driven purchase, it's a grudge purchase, but farming's surely a little bit different. People who really understand what it is that can happen and the impact on them. So what are the real policy considerations? And I think you've mentioned to me before, where do you think there might be some issues with this?
So I've been involved for 12 years or 13 years with environmental liability insurance since the environmental regulations really came in 2008. And my take on this is when it originally came out, we had a fairly homogeneous policy. An environmental liability policy set was roughly the same across the marketplace. But since that time, it's changed. Different insurers have started adding it to their combined policies as we've evolved. And so the different policies cover varies far more than I'm actually comfortable with as an insurance broker. And it is a difficult area for an insurance broker to understand. For instance, there are policies which, if we talk about slurry pits, well, there are policies out there that limit the cover based on the age of the slurry pit. So a slurry lagoon built before 91 with one insurer might be excluded, but included with another one. That's a good example because in my own background in dairy farming, we probably always had the slurry lagoon in the same place, but it wasn't always the same slurry lagoon. It's a bit like I've got the same broom over 30 years and I've replaced the handle 6 times and the brush 5 times. So these are problems. These are problems. Some policies exclude agricultural contract spraying. Some policies exclude the use of human waste on farmland. Some policies exclude OP dips. There's a lot of detail now, and my fear is that when policies change from one insurer to another at renewal, it's extremely difficult, almost impossible for the advisors, the brokers, to read the detail between the insurance policies and explain in detail to the farmers. Now, my take on this as well is that farmers are extremely environmentally sensitive and are extremely aware of their obligations and risks involved from an environmental front. And it's very, very difficult. And these are the pitfalls that brokers really need to take into account. Agents and brokers, when they're advising farmers on their cover. There are things in those policies. Certain policies will only act if there's an environmental agency prosecution board. Well, that's 6 months down the line, I'm sure, as my colleagues will say here. It doesn't happen on day one for sure. So it really gives loss adjusters a difficult time as well, because as Neil and John have mentioned, effectively they're working in a fluid situation, and they want to be sure that the client has the ability to pay through his insurance policy. It isn't a satisfactory situation at the moment. That is my bottom line on it. If that's okay.
That's interesting, Roger. I guess, Aidan, when you're dealing with this, and presumably you have to liaise with fellow insurers when things get complex. So how often does the policy cover differ in some of these claims? How complex does that make it for you to try and discover who's responsible for what?
Yeah, okay, it's always something that it's a grey area. That there's no doubt about it. The environmental liability wordings, I am sure across the board. I've personally only been dealing with NFU mutuals myself, but they are complex, and it is very much your interpretation. Thankfully, we have, as Roger had mentioned, I can well appreciate that some insurers will only respond when there is an active regulatory, I suppose, presence on a claim, never mind a prosecution. What we tend to view any environmental incident is if there is the possibility, which 9 times out of 10 there is, that any regulator would wish to be involved and would wish to see the remediation taking place, then that absolutely is when we get involved. The main, I suppose, real policy issues that we would come across is that very fact. Is there an active pollution condition? Is there environmental damage as the regulators see fit? We need that trigger. We need there to be that offsite migration, because going back to the basics, this is a liability cover. There must be another party, another subject, if you will, that is at risk of suffering damages, whether that be to controlled waters or if it's a neighbouring party. So those top things need to be checked off first before we can even consider granting an indemnity. But it is a very fast process, and it's not something you can agree on day one by no means. So if we do a quick checklist, I suppose, of what we deem is required to be done following any active pollution or active environmental damage, and take it from there. But in terms of other insurers, I wouldn't really be in communications with them about specific policy issues. I would be in great communications with our underwriting department, who essentially, of course, write the policy, and we speak about issues very, very frequently as well with our reinsurers. So it's good to keep everyone in the loop and of the same opinion of how we're dealing with these claims.
Okay, it's getting complex, I have to say. Thanks, John. I'm beginning to realise the tough challenge you're facing here, you guys at Questgates, when you get to deal with this. So the picture that I'm seeing painted just now is, and tell me if I'm getting it wrong, policyholders, as in farmers, who are pretty switched on, understand the consequences of the damage and perhaps understand their environmental responsibilities. So they're knowledgeable. We've then got them been advised in insurance, but what they're not knowledgeable about is insurance. So you then have to go on a claim and establish who's covered for what, who's at risk for what, whose responsibility is what, and then discover the levels of cover that they may have, which are not necessarily the same. As the one thing, as the Dean said, do it really quickly, will you, John? And it is 4:30 on a Friday night. I'm just trying to get you. Chris Hall should obviously, after that, Chris Hall will be giving you a salary increase, I'm sure. The way that. But how do you deal with that? I mean, that really sounds very complex. I know you're going to tell me it's exciting, you love it, but it really, really sounds difficult within the span of time that you have.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, well, starts on that. We do love them. We do love the different scenarios that we're faced with, because every site is different. They all have individual site specifics, different risks, different scenarios, different type of contaminants involved. So when this claim lands on our desk, so to speak, we're looking at the outset of the circumstances along with the policy cover as well. So we're going to deal with a number of clients and have an understanding of their policies and cover. As Roger was saying, there's big differences from one insurer to another, and obviously to cover all, everything is going to make it prohibitively expensive for an environmental impairment liability policy. But we will know which policies provide which elements of cover and have to guide, first of all, the customer, the insured, along with the contractors and the insurer from the outset. So this isn't something you can just pick up sort of on your first week of doing environmental work. This is many years of experience of understanding how the environment policies work through and through, and to establish the pitfalls from the outset. So we may be arranging for emergency response works to be undertaken, mitigation measures on a slurry wall that's collapsed, as Roger was saying as an example earlier. With slurry, and it may be that this predates 1991, and we would know that actually if it's not to current regulations, then there's not going to be any cover here. And we've got to balance that without prejudice investigation, mitigation response with the potential policy cover, along with having those open and frank discussions with the farmer from the outset. Obviously, they're under enormous strain when such an incident can happen, and we need to balance that with them through the mitigation works, as well as manage their expectations from policy cover. As far as the general policy cover it provides. You've got the sort of a standard commercial policy for farmers will have an element of material damage for own land clear up. So if it relates to oil, there may be an extension of £25,000 to clean up your land. It's not risk-based. It doesn't have to be going somewhere to cause a problem. They'll have cover for that cleanup to that limit. Beyond that, into the public liability world, you're then looking at sort of what limitations they've got. So it's got to be a sudden event for it to be covered or considered under a public liability policy. So any gradual incidents, any historic contamination, that's not going to be covered under a PL, along with own land cleanup, anything preventative and regulator charges as well. Going back to what sort of started the environmental liability specific policies was a case of Bartoline versus RSA in 2006, where the judge ruled essentially that the Environment Agency don't have any proprietary interest in controlled waters. They're the police of the environment. They don't own the environment. So if there's an impact to the environmental controlled waters, the Environment Agency have not suffered damages. And in the absence of any damages, there's therefore no cover under PL policy, as that only covers you for damages you're legally liable to pay. So that gave birth to the environmental impairment liability policy, which provides cover for those statutory charges subject to certain requirements. But it also did not require the pollution event to be sudden. So it's providing you for cover for a pollution condition, which is the discharge or dispersal of something, basically something being somewhere it shouldn't be as a result of your insured activities. It doesn't need to be a sudden event. It will include own land clear up as well. So if we exceed that £25,000 limit, or if there was no extension of material damage, it would pay to clean up your own land. Any preventative works as well to stop third-party damages arising. EA charges as well, the statutory regulator charges. So if there's any imposed remedial requirement upon the insured, you may have to have a particular third party at risk. But the environmental policy, again, going back to the basics, as Aideen said before, we're dealing with liability matters. So it covers you for damages you're legally liable to pay. But in addition, we're also going to pay you for the Environment Agency or equivalent regulator imposed remediation requirements. So it's very important if you're dealing with any kind of product which could result in a significant contamination event, such as in the agricultural industry, then an environmental impairment liability policy is highly recommended for that reason. But going back to what Roger said originally, we are dealing with multiple policies, multiple scenarios, multiple setups. What are the restrictions of that cover? And we've got to identify that at the outset, at the same point guiding Neil to get to site and start the appropriate mitigation and cleanup works. So he's getting his wellies on whilst we're trying to work out what will be paid by the insurer and what won't be paid by the insurer, unfortunately. So,
okay. Thanks, John. That was really informative. So then let's move that a bit further on to Neil, where I mean, I guess, first of all, the range of expertise you must have in your team's got to be phenomenal to cover all these different things. So you're going to be instructed to do everything as quickly as you can, but not till you're allowed to do it, which is a tough one as it is. And I guess this is really saying to me, you know, what challenges are you coming across when you get there? And to some extent, you've got to manage it. You've got the knowledge, you've got the expertise in terms of what's happening, how to either clear it up, stop it going further, whatever. The pressures of advising somebody that if we don't do something quickly, whether it's covered or not, then this environmental incident is going to become much worse. You know, there's equally as much as John's had to do a lot there. You guys have got to decide a lot very quickly and feed it back, presumably, to John.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's working in partnership, really. I mean, I've said some of the downsides, but in the majority of cases, the instructions we receive are usually, very good. It's telling us, in effect, it limits our risk by saying over this bank holiday, you don't spend more than X. So it sort of focuses our mind while people are looking at policy cover and things as to what we can do. The containment is key. We've got to stop it getting worse. That's the primary thing. Now, in most cases, because you're going out dealing with farmers are pretty, they've got their wellies on and they're very proactive, sometimes to a fault. So they just want to, it is a bit of a panic. There's no other word you can use, but sometimes they are wildly digging, trying to head things off, and it's just trying to calm the situation down. Yes, we've got to act as quickly as possible, but a few minutes isn't going to make, a huge difference. And, we've got to make sure everything's done safely as well. Yes, the environment is at risk, but it's, you don't want the farmer to be putting his sort of teams at risk and himself at risk and his family at risk as well. So from a health and safety point of view. So you just got to basically, take 5 minutes and understand what the situation is. But you're absolutely right. Because we know, we're not policy experts, but we know there's so many different policies that are going to cover this. What we do is we do the containment, and we have to do an investigation at the same time. And we're trying to see what is the ongoing, the impact on the ongoing and the future impact. And we actually investigate things in slightly different ways in terms of third party, the building's impact, so that we can actually feed that information back to John, so that they can start apportioning bits to different policies. So we can actually, if we just throw an enormous amount of information at them, it's not, it's just numbers. It's not a useful format. So we make sure that we target particular areas. But working with a farmer is key, because they know all their neighbours clearly, and a lot of it is sort of some negotiation with some of their neighbours as well. If you've got contaminants that have reached into ditches, you want to stop livestock elsewhere drinking from those ditches, and it's that sort of thing. John mentioned years of experience, and that's pretty much it. You can't just get someone with little experience, turn up on site and, read a text and understand what to do. It takes a lot of time to understand, and it takes a lot of local experience as well, in many cases, understanding what the watercourses do in the area. Where does it go? Is this going to go straight to ground? Is it going to be in surface water? Knowing if you've got, we've dealt in the last couple of years with ancient forests, which have been severely impacted. You can't replace an ancient forest, clearly. So you have to do anything you can to try and stop hitting that, because the penalties could be severe. It's very difficult to write a procedure for what needs to be done. It does come down to an enormous amount of experience.
Considerable experience, I would say, all round. And look at the complexities of this. But Roger, that's taken some of the stuff you opened up to a slightly greater understanding level for me, or probably a bit more scary, I think. So we've talked, Neil's gone there about the consequences of what would happen, stopping livestock, it was a small example of stopping livestock drinking out of ditches that may have come affecting a neighbouring farm. You mentioned earlier that you felt that for many brokers, the level of detail they would have to understand to advise properly would be very challenging. And the consequences of that initially might be, was the appropriate cover taken out? What are the real consequences of that shortage in cover? Where does it cover? Is it just a cut-off point, or is it some areas that aren't going to be done? And what are the big consequences for the policyholder?
Well, that's quite a wide question, that one. So I'm going back on the theme that we had in the last question here, about the differences between insurance policies, and about, let's take an example, indemnity limit. So within a policy, the policies range that I see from £500,000 indemnity limit to roughly £2 million indemnity limit. Now, I've personally been involved in a £1.2 million claim for liquid fertiliser. So if the policyholder had a £500,000 indemnity limit, then clearly he would be short by 700,000. And that could easily be the end of the family farm. That's how serious it is. When that liquid fertiliser went out, it could have been the end of the family farm if he had been sold the policy with the £500,000 limit. So there's an issue. The issue really is, from a broking point of view, that at renewal, the focus is on premium. This is across the combined policy. And the focus, sadly, isn't enough on the detail of the insurance cover. And that's the danger which brokers are running. And they really have to know what the farmers are doing. Farmers are, in my experience, are actually, if they're given the choice, they will pay for the widest environmental liability cover, because they are so attuned to environmental damage, because they know the potentials that they're running. So if they're given an informed choice, the money premium will not necessarily be the deciding factor. but they need to be given that choice. So it is a difficult one, but it's one that has absolutely far-reaching consequences when the arrow hits the target. For the family farms are generally not limited companies. So when something happens from an insurance point of view, particularly a liability, whether it's public, employers, environmental, everything is at stake. Everything's at stake. The property, the livelihood, everything. These are big numbers we're talking about here. So environmental liability is something which can be so costly. It has to be right. It's different to insuring, let's say we're insuring a barn or a workshop. Well, if we get the workshop tool insurance wrong for £15,000, that's £15,000. And which is also a lot of money. But compared to getting the environmental liability wrong, when those hit, and luckily they don't hit too often, but when they do hit, it's so expensive. And this is the point I'm trying to make, really. I've been to many CII type seminars, and you could hear a pin drop in the room when you talk about environmental liability. But I don't really see that attention to detail coming through. And that's where I think brokers really do have a responsibility to the farms, who look to them for advice. There's no easy way. You have to try and understand this subject, particularly as we move more into environmental land management payments, and the focus on environment is now going to increase as we go forward. Have I answered your question? Going first is sometimes a bit difficult on this.
Answers it. I think it answers it perfectly, but not. I guess half of what we do in these webinars is answer questions, but half of what we do is also what you're doing as well, Roger, which is asking the questions that need to be asked.
Yeah.
Challenged and need to be thought through. Let's move on again a little bit from that. So the next three people I'm going to ask quite simple question, which probably isn't going to be that easy to answer. And that is, what regulations and regulators are typically involved in the process, and what's their approach to pollution incidents in farms? We did touch a little bit on it earlier, but you know, what are the regulations and regulators and all of this? First of all, from the insurance angle.
So yeah, absolutely. The likes of the Environment Agency in England, Natural Resources Wales in Wales, the SEPA, Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and then the Northern Ireland Environment Agency as well. They all share similar roles. They all have enforcement powers when there is an active pollution incident, be it from a farm or another business. When they're alerted, usually our members and farmers, as Roger has very rightly said, they are so alert to the consequences when an environmental incident arises. So they are pretty good at ringing them up and saying, look, this has happened. What will I do? Can you help me? And they usually attend site pretty sharpish. If it's a serious enough event, they'll be there straight away. If it's not too serious, they will give advice over the phone in terms of containment measures. They usually will say it's probably a good idea to alert your insurance company if not already done. So they do give good advice, but yes, they are very alert to what is going on. They like to know that insurers are involved, and the likes of Neil and the teams are out on site containing the issue. But the usual regulations that they rely on are the likes of your Environmental Protection Act 1990, your Water Resources Act 91, the environmental permitting regs, and all of those allow the likes of the Environment Agency and their equivalents to enforce remediation. They can quite physically hand you an enforcement notice, a remedial notice, to undertake works. But as again, 9 times out of 10, the policyholder or the member are very actively getting involved, getting stuck in with their own digger, their neighbour's digger, if they have it, to get things done. So thankfully, those type of notices aren't always given. Just the regulator's presence sometimes is enough to give the member that little push to know that this is serious and goodness, we need to do something here. They do then take a step back. Personally, from what I've noticed, they do take a step back if they know the matter is in hand, the likes of John and Neil and the teams have a plan of sorts. Ourselves have granted cover. The regulators know that there's money coming in to, I suppose, feel what needs to be done to meet their standards, and they'll check in again in a couple of weeks, a month's time, to see how things are going. What they then, I suppose, tend to do sometimes, if it is a more serious event, the members can receive a warning, in the post, just to kind of clarify that we're not essentially happy that this has happened. Please don't let it happen again. Or they can take it that one step further and they can ask the member to attend a PACE interview. These days they've been more virtually done than attending the offices. So a solicitor then needs to be assigned to the member to help them derive their responses to what the regulators are asking of them. And it's pretty much a formal interview to lay out what exactly has happened, why the member feels it has happened, and what they can do to essentially prevent it from happening again. That can hopefully be the end of the legal side of things once these events have happened. But again, as we all know, they can proceed to the court, and prosecution can then happen, unfortunately, depending again how serious the incident was and if there was enough public interest to, I suppose, vouch for a prosecution. These usually involved huge fish kills, wildlife affected, natural areas of outstanding beauty affected, things like that really do make the headlines in some cases. So it's a very much a case-by-case basis. The regulators do have powers. They're not afraid to use them. And I suppose good cooperation and good communication with them from the outset does always benefit everybody involved. And I have to say, our suppliers are great at liaising with them and explaining the jargon to our members, what powers they have, why they are doing this, and to help everybody, I suppose, reach the end point. If that answers your question.
Yeah,
okay.
that does. And again, John, that then passes the next bit of pressure back down. You get there, you're dealing with the claim. I guess you have to know what environmental agencies can be involved, even better, should be involved, and thirdly, had better be involved. And that probably changes as you go through the claim. And then I guess as you go through, and Neil alluded to this earlier, I think you did well, all of a sudden, a few days later, something shows that it was worse than you thought initially, the scenario you got earlier, then do you have to change again? So who are the regulators you deal with, and how easily do you keep the right ones involved?
The honest opinion is, if you have a pollution event on a commercial or agricultural site, then you should notify the Environment Agency from the outset, even if it turns out to be nothing too severe. Delayed notification can put the Environment Agency on the wrong foot to start with, and the worst thing that can happen is that a member of the public notifies the regulators. They then spend a day or two tracing that contamination back to the farmer, who then starts off on the wrong foot with them, gets the notice served there and then. They'll have various regulations. AD mentioned a few of them before that they can quote, and there's on the back of the notice they'll tick the relevant ones, hand it to the farmer, and hopefully at that point the insurers are already involved. But if not, then we're arranging to get to site with Neil, and it's very important that we get out to see with Neil and his team as well, so we can coordinate things of what's going to be covered and what's not going to be covered. But with the regulators, we want to open into a dialogue with them sooner rather than later. Things will change on a site. It will be something far more severe than originally anticipated, or a lot a smaller event than first feared, but we'll keep updated with the Environment Agency or counterparts throughout. And by keeping that level of communication open with them, that does have a huge impact on the outcome. As AD was saying, that we've not only dealing with a pollution event under a subject of insurance cover, we're also dealing with a farmer's livelihood, potentially a family business that's 5 generations down the line, potentially coming to an end if the insurance cover is not there. And throughout all of that, if there's going to be a prosecution, we need to help guide the insured and the regulators through that, and having that right level of communication. And again, as Neil agreed with before, it's all about experience, by being able to not necessarily force a scenario one way or another, but to certainly influence the regulators for the most realistic and pragmatic outcome of any given scenario. And a lot of that is all dealt with from the outset of the claim. So having all that communication at the beginning makes a huge effect come case interview with the Environment Agency or counterparts, or potentially prosecution if that's unfortunately where it goes to. One thing to consider though is that when you're dealing with an Environment Agency officer, they're reporting to people, of course, but the people on the ground, as with anyone in any industry, they're going to have different requirements, different ways of doing things, and it will vary from region to region as to what the regulator or equivalent will impose. And this may be, whether it's in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, but it also can be by county as well. It's all down to that local officer. They may find a particular site is not as concerning, it's not as sensitive as another site, and therefore they might not have specific requirements or not be overly concerned with the contamination event. And that leads us, I'll pass over to Neil for this, because we are very reliant on Neil's knowledge of the local area and feeding this information back to us for policy considerations, but also for regulator discussions with regards to how sensitive is this particular site. Is it a principal aquifer? Have we got a very sensitive groundwater area? Is there anything at risk nearby? Private abstraction drinking water points that either serve the public or private wells? We need to understand all of this from the outset. If there's absolutely nothing in the nearby area, the regulators may not be that bothered about what really happens, and we have to sort of pay that into consideration for the cleanup side of things. But if it's a very sensitive area, we need to guide all parties from the outset with that. I don't know whether you'll agree with that, Neil, that we need to establish that quite quickly.
Thanks, John. I will give Neil a chance to answer that in a minute because it's the last answer. But yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, and working together is obviously very key with Neil's team there. But there are two things to come up. First of all, I remember from earlier talking about farmers having the knowledge and trying to do something, and they quite rightly said they will act really, really quickly. One of the fears I would have in that just getting done is they may get work done quickly, but are they taking the right action? They may be taking what appears to be the obvious action, but a little knowledge is sometimes the dangerous thing. So one, does that happen, Neil? And secondly, how easy is it to deal with the regulators when you're going through it? You have to take the action because they're telling you to do it, but we haven't actually established if it's covering it.
Yeah, as I say, there's a couple of questions there. Yes, farmers are very proactive and they do try and sort things out themselves, sometimes to a fault. But it's as simple a situation to be. There's a release of something where they found some contaminated material somewhere, and they won't want it anywhere near the livestock or something like that, or near a watercourse. So they'll decide to pick it up and put it somewhere else. What they will be doing is they'll be transferring that contamination to another part of their farm where it could start leaching into the ground somewhere else. And we've had issues before where insurers have said, well, hold on, if we'd have paid for it being dealt with in the original location, but you picked it up and put it in a much more sensitive location and made the matter worse. So they do need to talk to about us before taking action. That is certainly true, and it's the same with groundwater as well. I mean, something like in England and Wales, a third of our drinking water still comes from groundwater. Well, your instant response when you're on site is to try and stop things going to a surface water course, but actually that might be the safest place for it to go because you can contain it in the surface water in the river. It actually digging a hole and putting it somewhere else, then coming into contact with groundwater could be far worse. We've probably dealt with, I would say, 10 farmers who've contaminated their own drinking water supply by actions they've taken. And it's quite costly then to have to try and relocate their drinking water borehole somewhere on the site. So yeah, it comes down to everybody said, just talk to us and we'll work out the best plan for the site. Regulator-wise, everybody's got a bad thing to say about regulators, but they have a job to do, and someone has to police what we're all doing, and they do that pretty effectively. And farming, like I said earlier, it's 9% of serious pollution incidents, so it's quite high up on their agenda. I think they did a lot of inspections back in 2019 on one river, and I think they found 85 non-conformances on slurry storage on that one stretch. there's some serious work still needs to be done to bring sort of storage facilities up to standard. But the agency on the whole, as everybody has said, work with them at an early stage. What I would be very careful of is that they are trained in asking questions. So it's exactly the same as if you get asked to go to a police station, you wouldn't go on your own to answer questions. You take legal cover or advice with you. It's exactly the same when the agency want to start asking you questions as well. Be very careful how you start answering questions. Farmers are very good at telling everything. That might not, I'm not saying they're telling anything wrong. It's just sometimes it's the way in which you explain it, and backtracking on the way you've explained something, even if you explained it incorrectly, is quite difficult. So take advice on how you're going to answer the questions. But everybody's correct. If you work with the agency in the beginning, keep giving them weekly and monthly updates of where you are. It's very rare. They may send you warning letters that they're considering taking legal action, but if you keep on top of what you need to do and discussing the remediation you're doing with them and the action you're taking, 9 times out of 10, we find that you keep the agency on side. And there's some frustration when we get to a certain point where it's contained before we then proactively do a cleanup, because that's where it is establishing what is the farmer going to contribute, what is the insurance company paying, and you might get a small delay at that point. There's no further ongoing pollution; it's just a small delay. That really worries the agency at that point, because they couldn't care less whether the farmer or the agencies or the insurance is paying. They just want it done. And it's a matter of negotiating and keeping everybody happy that they're still progressing. It's just, there's a few things to sort out first. But it's giving them confidence all the time.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think what we've done in this first one in the series in the agricultural side, I think we've crystallised the issues. I think resolving them sounds quite complex. That's something we're obviously going to have to revisit in the coming months. But I think we've enough experts here that tell people who are unsure that if you want to contact any of the 4 panelists, please do it directly or come through me at alan@iloveclaims.com. I think they have plenty of good advice about their expert areas and what you could do, but it's obviously something we need to do more. So thank you very much to Roger, to Aidan, to John and Neil for taking part. Just a quick plug, we have our Home and Commercial Networking Lunch on the 1st of October in London. Visit our website and let me know if you're interested. And back to conferences with a bit of luck, he says, crossing his fingers, 11th of November, the main home property conference will take place at the Recoop Arena in Coventry. At each of these events, there's more than 400 claims professionals at it, lots of good networking, and lots of good advice and talking from people such as the 4 panelists we have had this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. Any questions? alan@iloveclaims.com. You've been listening to the webinar on the ILC Home and Commercial Series looking at environmental and agricultural claims. My name is Alan Suter. I'm the chair of ILC Home and Commercial. Again, a big thanks to our major sponsor, Questgates, and to our silver sponsor, RSK Raw, for the support. If you get any questions or suggestions connected to this subject, please just drop me a note at alan@iloveclaims.com. I'll be delighted to hear from you, and we look forward to speaking with you again in this series in the next webinar.